Hey, and welcome back, everybody, to Com 498, your thesis class. This is week 3, and we're going to do a discussion of some theories today. But before we get to that, a couple things just to touch on. One is this thing you're seeing here. I had some people complain a little about me not being very clear in some videos. I think it's because I'm Southern and, I try to correct it, but sometimes that just Appalachian sound comes out. So I got a new microphone to try to filter some of that out, and I'll just try to speak better. And also, my screen. Some people were telling me that it was hard to see what I was referring to on the screen when I would show you like your syllabus or the notes. And that's because I can only record up to I think it's 780, whatever that's measured in, the quality. I can't get up to the 1080, which is much better, but we got to take what we have. So remember, as you follow along with the lectures, you can go to the course pack and follow that way. So you should be able to see exactly what I'm seeing and making notes of. Beyond that, a couple other things. So this week we're again talking about theories, but the reason we're doing that is because in your projects, in your thesis projects, you're going to want to incorporate some theoretical components. And really, I don't want you to sort of get lost in the idea of, oh gosh, this is like this com theory part 2. It's not that. It's just that when you're making these assumptions or you're asking these questions that you're going to end up using for your bigger project, you want to be able to root it in theory on some level. It doesn't have to be this theoretical piece. I mean, it can definitely be a real question with a real answer, but theory is going to help us understand either why we see what we're seeing or why the answer that we are suggesting is right and that it's supported by a com theory. So we're going to get into those here in just a minute. Before that, last thing, I want to jump over. Let me just shrink myself. Here, the style survey. So this week, you all filled out that style survey. And from the looks of things, most of you, or all of you, are on the subjective side. So you're more likely to use some qualitative approaches. Remember, those from last week are things like phenomenology, case study. You could do an ethnography, a narrative. So you've got some options here. That doesn't mean because you seem to lean this way that's the way you'll go. Especially if you look here like at Kayla, you were only one away, so you were close. Same thing with Hannah, very close. But then other folks like Kevin and Matthew, for example, 1 to 6, you had a 5-point margin where you were very much to that side. So, again, I'll give you both as we go and continue. But as we continue, you should be narrowing things down a little bit in terms of your topic and the way that you want to study that topic. And that will help us decide specifically what is right for you. So let's go ahead and switch it over. Let me get this guy down. Let's look at the syllabus. So this week, again, is week 3. And what's due this week, you're watching the video, so good. But your topic idea or ideas and feedback are this week. So what you're supposed to do now is go to the Blackboard site. And let me just make sure while we're all together that I have a place for that. Let's go here. Whoops. Yeah, right here, topic ideas. So this is where you're going to post what you're thinking about. You don't have to have anything set in stone yet, but you are going to need to be sort of on that path. And so tell us some ideas you have. Then comment on other folks too. You might need to check back in, Friday, Saturday, and give some feedback to other people. Not in terms of that's a good idea, bad idea, but if we look at the assignment here, you'll see the idea is that you're going to be able to likely help each other in some way. So if you have seen something, read something, or aware of something out there that might be useful to that person given their topic, you could go ahead and tell them about it. Again, it's not so much of a good idea, bad idea, but things that are actually tangible that they can go out, get, and then use, maybe. And so that'll be due at the end of this week. You don't have to respond to everyone, but if you could respond to a couple folks, that'd be great. Sorry, I got a new light too, and clearly it's got a mind of its own. Okay. Moving on. This week, as I said, week 3. So as we get there, notice that we've already talked about the basic research process, regardless of what kind you're doing. We've got that survey that you completed. Then we've got the 2 dimensions of theory and research charts that we discussed. Here are some meta-theoretical assumptions, lots of new information there. Talked about some quantitative approaches and qualitative approaches. Again, these are the specific things that you'll choose. And then the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. So with that, don't forget to do that. Last time I told you I thought it was only the short course and the general one, and that's right. So just go back, watch that part of the video if you need to. It was at the very end of last week's video, and you can even just Google GVSU IRB, and that'll take you to the CITI training. You'll then hit log in with your institutional information, select Grand Valley, sign in like you would anything else at Grand Valley, and that will take you where you should be to take the courses that you need. Now, this week again is theory, but it's not obviously every theory. I mean, that would just be a whole class, right? I mean, you've probably taken comm theory. And so if that's the case and you had a theory that you really connected with or related to in that course, you can definitely go back and maybe use that if it's appropriate. I advise you to, no matter what you thought of your theory class, to go back and review any notes that you have still. That might be useful. I'm going to explain these theories to you, but to hear it explained from a couple different positions is often useful in order to get a fuller understanding of what the theory aims to do, what its purpose is. Now, I've sort of called this the greatest hits because it's some very common themes or theories that are used, or things that have been fairly useful in the past. There are some that are fairly broad, so you can apply them to a lot of different areas, and so we're going to cover these. Now, I've divided it up as best I can into types of theories, and so the first one is gender and critical approaches. And if you'll remember from last time, when we hear that word critical just means that you're trying to cause change in a society, in your culture. So you want to improve something. And so these theories, these 2, are 2 feminist theories that, of course, are trying to improve the position of women in our culture. The first comes from Deborah Tannen, and it's called co-cultural theory. The idea here is that men and women communicate in different ways. There's a lot of talk out there about men and women being wired differently. Our brains just work different. We're so different, and that's just not true. There are some differences biologically, of course, not physiologically. I'm talking about mental wiring, if you will, but there's many more similarities than there are differences. So with that being true, and we know it's true that on average, men and women communicate differently, what's causing it? And this theory explains that. And so before we get into any details, if you are doing a study and you want to look at differences between the way men and women send messages, this could be a theory for you. So what this says is that both men and women can use masculine and feminine forms of communication. I don't want you to think masculine only means men, feminine only means female. But masculine communication is usually more directive. And you see some examples of this in just a minute. But what she argues, Deborah Tannen argues, is that women and men are raised differently, that we are basically like little subcultures of the larger collective culture. And there's a book out there, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, and that's just, it's a terrible book, because it does highlight all those different wirings, and it attributes all the difference to that, and that's just not true. Some differences between the way men and women communicate are, for example, report talk versus rapport talk. And so men often communicate, or a masculine style often uses communication to report information or to give directions. Whereas feminine communication styles build relationships and maintain relationships. Again, it's not to say that masculine never does anything about relationships and that feminine never does anything about directions or reports. But the idea here is that girls and boys are given and shown different expectations for the behavior. They're raised differently. There's an assumption out there that girls are better at communication and boys are better at STEM stuff. And what that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, it is arguably true if you look at numbers and grade point averages and professionals in the field. So, for example, in the School of Comm at Grand Valley, we are about 80% female in terms of student body makeup. And so there is a larger amount of women in the area of communication. But if you go over to engineering, for example, one of the young women at the speech lab that works there is an engineering major. And she's the only female in a lot of her classes. So, it's true that there are more men in that field, more women in this field, but that is because of the way we're taught. Because we tell people that's the norm, they believe that's the norm, and then they act it out. This is a lot of this goes back to how we play as children. Men will often play things like, toys with guns and racing, and there's always a winner, there's a good guy, there's a bad guy. It's cut and dry, black and white. And that's much more what engineering is, right? It has to be at a certain angle, and it can only be at that angle in order for the whole machine to work properly, and we got to find it great. Whereas girls are often brought up playing other games. Let's play house, let's play dolls, and then they will interact, they'll communicate. Okay, who's going to be the baby? Who's going to be the mommy? That kind of thing. And so we give them literal baby dolls, right? Like, here, learn how to nurture this thing. It's not real, so practice on it. I mean, obviously we don't tell little girls that directly, but that's what we're implying. So it should be no surprise that then women are better at rapport and men are better at report because we get more practice. And that's, again, from a very young age. Other differences here in these masculine styles: men are more assertive, and they say things like "we should do something," or masculine style is more assertive. And if women are assertive, there's a particular word a lot of people use for that, and it's bitch. And that's not fair, but that's often what it will be. If a male is assertive, oh, what a leader. He's so strong. He's very direct and clear. We love it. But when she does it, especially for older generations, it's fading, thank God. But she just gets this bad reputation as just that. Oh, she's such a bitch. She just always is in your case. And so we know that's not the case. You can be a really nice person and still be very direct and clear. Masculine style is often used to solve problems. Here's what you should do. With this one, you could think of maybe talking to mom and dad. If your parents, if you were fortunate enough to have both, you may have experienced this if they were both traditional communicators. So if you come home with a problem from school and you talk to your dad, dad's more likely to say, okay, what you need to do is, and then give you a prescription to fix that problem. Whereas mom would be much more likely to say things like, well, tell me more about how that happened. And well, how did that topic even end up coming up? Well, what did so-and-so say about it? They want to know more information so that they can get a fuller picture of the relationships that are at play. Again, we don't need to know that we're looking for these things by name and discuss it the way we're talking about it here, but that's still the act that we're doing. Masculine communication always is used when we're creating strategies We even call it things like a plan of attack, a game plan like sports, right? That's very masculine language where you get this first, second, third. In If you think about your research styles that you just did that quiz on or the survey on, if you're a masculine communicator and a masculine researcher, you're likely going to use quantitative approaches because that's very directive. First, second, third, cut and dry, no room for how did you feel about it. It's just tell me what you did, what was next, what was the result, just science. And then last, masculine communication is often used to attract attention to yourself. So bragging or doing what's known now as the humble brag, which is a great tool. I don't know too much about that, but I tried it once and did really well, but that doesn't mean that I'll be good at it again. Oh no. Both, again, men and women use humble brags and bragging in general, but it's considered a masculine style. You might hear it referred to in pop culture as peacocking. If you think of a peacock, when it spreads its feathers out, it's to attract a mate. And that's what a lot of people are doing when they verbally peacock, and they want to seem bigger or more important than they are. And so they do that kind of behavior. Now, feminine style of communication, what we've got here, a private assertion. That's one-on-one communication, or a dyad, meaning two people with like a BFF. So if you're talking to one person that you're very familiar with, you might be a little more assertive because that person knows you well. But in a mixed group or strangers, feminine style is much less assertive. It also often tells a story in order to explain situations and to teach lessons. So this is like a parable, right? So women will often, or people who use feminine style, will often explain things in terms of their own experience. So, if you had a situation, again, you're coming home from school and you got in an argument with someone and you both got detention, right? And mom is much more likely to say things like, oh, well, yeah, I remember once when I was in school, and then they'll tell you a similar experience they had. Whereas dad might just be like, well, what did you do to get detention? And is that right? Were you doing that? Well, then I'd suggest you don't do that anymore. Great. And that's the talk, right? That's it. Feminine style is often used for listening more than it is speaking. And when we do speak after listening in feminine style, we'll often do paraphrases. So what I hear you saying is, so are you saying that? So am I right to think that this is the way it was? We want to verify understanding when we use a feminine style. That's not a masculine trait, because masculine communication is less concerned with what you think and less concerned with if I am interpreting something right. It's much more concerned with how I interpret it and how I respond to it. Much more cut and dry. Questions, it's kind of the same thing. Oh, that's right. Yeah, what I hear you saying is, it's the listening. Questions would be more like, how did this happen? How did it make you feel? Again, in a search for more information and understanding. If there was conflict, you would get much more of a search for a background and the root of a problem. So if feminine style is going to be prescriptive, it wants to get to the root of the problem and solve that, as opposed to treating a symptom. Whereas a masculine style might treat the symptom and not really get to the root of what's wrong. Last but not least, nonverbal communication. Feminine style is much more aware of things like sarcasm or looking at faces to gauge a misunderstanding, difference in cultures in terms of what some things may mean depending on where you're from. Masculine style, again, doesn't do that as much. And if it does, it would only respond, well, it would most likely respond to anything non-verbally that it considered a threat to its validity. So if someone looked confused, a feminine style communicator would seek to clarify the confusion. If a masculine communicator felt someone was confused based on their nonverbals, they'd probably just ask them like, what's that face all about? Or what don't you get? As opposed to, wait, so am I hearing this right? That you see the difference, right? So again, we know that this happens, and it's not just men and women, but that's the trends. We know that that's likely because boys and girls are raised differently, and we're taught communication has different uses. And so that's where this idea of a co-cultural theory comes from. So again, if you want to explain why men and women communicate differently, whether that's in social media or you name it, it could even be like a dating site. That might be something fun to study. You'll see that this is fairly common, and now you'll be able to explain it. All right, the next theory is standpoint theory. This is one of my personal favorites. Like when I learned this the first time, it just kind of blew me away. The idea here, this is from mainly from Julia Wood. A standpoint is the place from which you view the world. It's your world more specifically. So where are you in terms of a dominant or subjugated continuum, right? So are you, in our culture at least, a alpha white male with high socioeconomic status? That is going to be the top. Whereas someone at the more subjugated end might be an LGBTQ woman of color from a very low economic status. And I'm not by any means saying that one of those is better than the other. No. Just hear me on this, right? It's your standpoint and where society places you on that continuum. And you can think of it as marginalized versus prominent. And if you've ever seen the movie The Help, they do a great job of showing you standpoint theory without ever mentioning it by name. So if you're not familiar with the movie, you've got Mississippi in the 1950s or early 60s. And there are lots of black women who are domestic service workers. So they're cleaning houses, they're making food, they're nannying, that kind of stuff. And at the time, of course, that work was very underrated. A lot of these women were neglecting their own families and homes to take care of white people's families and homes, because that's what they had to do to survive. So when you're that dependent on some other group, you're very marginalized. And, that's what we would expect from Mississippi in the 50s, unfortunately. But what we learned from that movie, among other things, is that when you are marginalized, you have a broader view of the world. There are different ways that you can interpret the world and different ways that you can make your way through the world. And so if you think about women as a marginalized group, that's traditionally the way things are in American culture. And again, you can add in race, class, gender, socioeconomic status, all that. But there are usually higher expectations for marginalized people. So we expect things to be just right. So in The Help, they wanted their house to be immaculate, and they wanted their children to be taken care of as the best that anyone could take care of children. But the rewards were much lower. I mean, the pay was hardly anything. And you could fire them for any reason, and then you could just talk about them in town and no one else would hire this person. Oh man, right? That's a tough spot to be in. If you want to also think about sort of maybe in your own household, I don't know how it was for you, but for me, this worked very well. So the sexual division of labor. When I was growing up, everything outside the house, outside the actual home, Dad did, right? So mowing the grass, shoveling snow, trimming, planting stuff, washing the outside of the house, washing the cars, painting the outside, like all that. That was Dad. If it was inside the house, with the exception of painting walls, it was Mom. Cleaning, laundry, dishes, cooking, vacuum, like Mom, right? So that's your sexual division of labor. And these are often either very rigidly divided. Like there is no, hey, would you mind to do the laundry tonight? We would call that the, oh wow, I've just gone blank on it. It's the reward of mediocrity, basically, where you could just say, yeah, I'm not very good at laundry, you better do it. Like you're not good. the machine does it. You just have to push the right button. But men will often use that as a get out of work free card. But the idea here is that, I remember going with my mom most weekends to get groceries, or, if we were going to go shop for other things, I would go with her. And I remember her buying my dad clothes, and, men's pants come in sizes that are one number by another number. So like a 36 inch waist, 32-inch inseam. And most women know how that works. However, when you flip it, I remember one Christmas I was with my dad and we were shopping for a dress for my mom, and the guy, it was actually a woman, it was the salesperson. She asked, "What size is she?" And he said, "I don't know, about a medium." And she was like, "Oh, no, I mean like a 6 or an 8, somewhere in there." I have no idea. She's about your size. And that was it, because there wasn't this need to know sizes. But since mom was expected to buy his clothes and her clothes, she had to know both. He only needed to know one so that he could take care of himself when necessary. So again, this is just one way to think of how we have a different standpoint. And because we are more marginalized, we see things clearer. We have more knowledge. We can make our way through the world. And so that's just what it means. Required to understand and adapt to the ways of those with more power. And power, again, you're not required to know what the marginalized folks do. You could also think of this with language use. So if you think about African American English or African American vernacular or dialect, whatever you want to call it, there are differences in the way that a lot of folks speak based on who they are. Even where I'm from, and I'm from West Virginia originally, and we have the Appalachian dialect. Appalachian is very poor. It's the poorest part of the country, right where Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky come together. It's really bad. You don't want to be there. Hazard, Kentucky. So with that, we speak in a certain way when we're together that most people wouldn't understand what we're saying. And that is because we knew that we were a marginalized group. And so if we created our own style, then it wouldn't be as easy for other people to take advantage of us, because we could talk right in front of them and they would never know. The big example of this is prison. When people are in prison, they'll create their own languages so that the guards won't be able to know what they're talking about, even if they're listening. And so with that, those prisoners, or the people in Appalachia, or the people who speak African American vernacular, those folks need to know their specialized local, if you will, language, but they also need to be able to speak the language of those who are in power or in front of them in the societal pecking order. That way they can survive in all those worlds, their own and the other. So the idea comes away from the more marginalized you are, the more intelligent you arguably are. You have more savvy, more savoir-faire, as you may call it. So women being marginalized, yep, they're set back a little. So they have to understand women's world and men's world. Women of color, they have to understand women of color's world, white women's world, and masculine world. Queer women, they have to understand, straight or hetero women, cis women's world, and masculine world. And probably, since they're a member of the LGBTQ community, sort of like male gay culture, they have to understand all that, because those people are ahead in the pecking order. Again, I'm not saying it's right. It's just the way things are. And then way at the back there, queer women of color, they really need to be able to speak all the different languages, think all the different ways, understand all the different elements at play in all those levels, so that they can survive. They can interact and move through and live their lives. Whereas again, people at the top, they don't always have to go backwards in that societal order. They can just be able to communicate with other people like them, and that's all they need to do their whole life. I mean, lots of examples here, but you pick your 1960s, 1970s movie and go with it. You'll see it all over the place. All right, so that's standpoint theory. Where you are in the world in terms of being marginalized matters. You might use this also for how people make messages or how they code switch. So, for example, when I go back to West Virginia, without even thinking about it, I snap back into that Appalachian dialect. I remember the last time I was there, which has been, 5-6 years ago, when I went to a gas station. I pulled in and I was going inside to get something to drink and pay for my gas. And so when I walked in, the woman working said in a very Appalachian way, "Hey baby, how are you?" Just like that. And my response without thinking was, "I'm all right, mama, how you doing?" Just boom, hit it. I got a PhD at this point, and it's just, it is what it is. It's who we are. And so we are able to communicate with that group because I don't want to be alienated when I'm there. But I also have a PhD and I'm a professor, so I need to be able to not be alienated by this group, and then everything in between. All right, next up, we have muted group theory. This is put out by Charis Kramer. She says that muted groups are people who belong to these marginalized groups whose views are often overlooked or discounted by those from more affluent groups, based on sex, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, that kind of thing. The idea here is that those in power get to choose the language. They get to name things. And so if you think about a historical perspective, America, for example, is named after a guy named Amerigo Vespucci, who was an Italian map maker. That was his thing. And so he made the first map of America. And so that's where we get the name from. District of Columbia is Columbus, right? Those sorts of things. We came to America, Europeans, historic Europeans, me, came to America and sort of saw ourselves as more important than the folks who were already here. And so therefore our names for things must be more important. Don't forget, and we're in a great area, to sort of see these examples. Everything already had a name when we got here, right? I mean, this whole area had a name. And if you go to the downtown campus, right behind I think it's the Kennedy Center, there is a walkway by the river, and there's a statue of a Native American with the original name of the Grand River. And, we just called it the Grand River because that made more sense to us, and we were the ones in power because at that point we had guns and we could do what we wanted when it came to natives. And so, again, I'm not making the argument any of this is right. It's the way things are. This is true with land, animals, people, ideas, you name it. And this gets us into this idea that tradition carries over. And the more that we're able to connect with an ongoing, powerful tradition, the more likely we are to seem honest or intelligent. And if you're not in line with that setup, you're more likely to look maybe less honest and less intelligent. So the idea here is, you might hear things put in a way that might be like, oh, it's just a guy thing. Big example, when Donald Trump was running for president, then the Access Hollywood tapes came out. His defense wasn't, I didn't say that, it's a made up recording. It was that was just locker room talk, or that was just guy talk. And so as a rich white male, he was able to get by with that. I mean, getting elected president is the ultimate getting by with that, right? Whereas, can you imagine if he would have been a black man and said those things, like, oh, he's referring to a white woman when he says, I just start kissing them or I grab them by the stuff. No, he would have never, ever won it. Barack Obama said that. No, kick him out, put him on trial. He's a rapist. Oh my God. But not when you're in the dominant group, apparently. And that is because men are seen as gatekeepers of communication. So, right there, what is said, what they mean, how we think about certain things. And for this, you could even look at sort of the scientific forefathers, if you will. I mean, there were women in there too, like Madame Curie. But when we think of Darwin and Einstein and Tesla and Edison, I mean, you've got sort of these great scientific minds, and we always associate them with being male, and that changes the way that we see our world. However, the muted groups, like standpoint theory, are seen in this context, as muted group, as being more intelligent and, again, more versatile. So muted folks, again, have to understand that marginalized language they use as well as the dominant language. So they have to be able to name things, think about things in terms of the dominant mindset, but also they're able to have their own mindset and way of thinking about things. So this is why a lot of folks aren't very good at, standardized testing. So in standardized testing, the questions are often written by white men. And so other white men speak that same language. They've heard it. They've grown up with it. It's been spoken to them. They speak it. It's there. Now, it's all English for sure, but marginalized groups are less likely to use this exact language or to use it as frequently or to have heard it as long as white males have. And so we should not be surprised when white males do better on standardized testing than any other group. It's because the language is sort of home field. I mean, it's your people making up the language. I mean, this would be like, the Super Bowl is coming up, and Tampa Bay is going to the Super Bowl, and they're playing at Tampa Bay. How great, right? I mean, that's home cooking, and it's something that is similar here in terms of playing the linguistic game of being an effective communicator. So a couple other things here as examples of this. Think about just something as simple as colors. So study after study has shown that men know fewer colors than women. Now, this has nothing to do with what they can perceive, what they can see. Yeah, color blindness is more prominent with males, but that's not the point here. The idea is that, and I was just teaching my son this weekend, with blue, for example. I got 4 or 5 different things in his room that were blue, and I said, which one's really blue? And he pointed to what he thought was the most blue. And I said, that's right, that is blue. Is this blue? Uh-huh. Is this one blue? Yeah. But they're all a little different, so they all have different names. Now, most masculine communicators would say things like, oh, there's light blue, dark blue, maybe like a navy blue or sky blue, and then there's just regular old blue. Okay. Whereas women would be much more likely to use the actual names of the colors. Right? So yeah, there is blue, there's navy blue, electric blue, periwinkle, is chartreuse, is that a blue? I mean, so just these extensive vocabulary for shades of the same color. Why is that the case? Well, because if you again had both mom and dad around the house, you probably have seen your dad go to your mom and say, does this match? Well, you can't see it? No, I can. It just, to me, it's like, oh, close enough. But mom may say something like, no, you can't wear that. That's like a navy blue. And then the other one is like I don't know what you want to call it, a midnight blue. So no, those won't work. And that language is just expected that they would have that knowledge because they're women for some reason. But we see here through this example that it's the case. Since that expectation is set, there's often this learning that goes with understanding things simply like colors, where men, not so much. The next example with labeling experience, and you see permission versus consent. So I'm part of the Knowledge Market Advisory Committee, so where I run the speech lab. And this is the Writing Center, all the places you have to go this semester. Don't forget that. We were making a new privacy policy, and we wanted to talk about getting permission/consent to share session notes with people other than the student, the client. And the question came up, which word do we use, permission or consent? And is there a difference? Does it matter? Is this just a game that we could play with a thesaurus? Well, those who are masculine communicators, masculine-minded communicators would say it doesn't matter, whatever. Permission, consent, same difference. But those two have very different, connotative meanings. I mean, the idea of consent is much more bodily. It's giving someone permission, sure, but to do something with your private being. And we went with consent because, we want the sessions that we run, while most of them won't be of a personal nature, if someone does say something or, give us information in confidence, we want them to know that, that's private. And we're not going to share something that's private with other people without your consent. And so again, for feminine-minded communicators, they would see this as a very big difference in why we chose one over the other. Masculine-minded communicators, it probably wouldn't matter. So those are three gender/critical theories that you might use to explain why males, females communicate differently, or to make a prediction about it. Now, let's switch gears and we'll go down to developing and expressing identity. These are some of my favorites. This is much more from psychology, but we use it in communication because we sort of believe the idea that communication studies messages, but we also believe that we tell people who we are and people tell us who we are through communication messages, and that impacts our psychology. So the first one is from Charles Cooley. This is in the 1911, I think, somewhere way back there's where he started. But the looking glass self. And what he basically says is that, yeah, we do have this sort of a nature argument where our ancestral bloodline, as he called it, determines some things about us, our size, our skin pigment, facial features, some of our behaviors, that kind of stuff. But we also have this social history, and that's our culture, experiences, relationships, education. And the two of these, nature, nurture, often come together, should come together, and create the self. And the self, as you see there, is your inner feelings about who they are, as well as how you express who you are. And it really comes down to the self being created, or definitely heavily influenced by, the looking glass self. So while we will say things like, I am this, when this happened to me, I and me statements, the idea here, big picture, is that people tell us who they see us as, and we internalize that. So it says here, we learn what others think about us, either directly or indirectly. So they might say it to us, or they might not say something, and that leads us to think about, oh, they must think I'm this way. A lot of this can be imagined. But his line of thinking in bold there is that we'll get someone else's perception of us. We will then factor that into our evaluation of who we are, and that will cause us to be exactly that, a personal identity shift toward what they're telling us we are. Now, primary, secondary group perceptions matter. What that means is simply if someone's closer to you, a loved one, family member, boyfriend, girlfriend, that kind of stuff, those folks are primary, and whatever they say carries more weight than someone off the street that you don't know, or someone that you don't know as well, don't care as much about. So this is why when you see little kids, for example, who might grow up and think that they're really smart, and bless their hearts, they're just not sometimes, but they think they are. largely because, God bless them, their parents said things like, "You're so smart. You are just so smart." I mean, I say this all the time. You know, "You're so smart. You're so strong. You're so nice. You're so pretty. You're so good. You're so," because I want my son to internalize that and really believe that he is those things. And then hopefully my hope is that he will then act out what it means to be good, smart, nice, that kind of thing. But on the other hand, you may have someone very smart. This is what happens in abusive relationships, where they are constantly told, "You're so dumb. No one would want you. You're worthless." You know, these terrible things. And even though it's not true, they come to believe it because it's been told to them. So there you go. Interaction with other people. They give you an evaluation or their perception of you that shifts your personal identity in some way, and then you express that new identity based on the input of the other people. That's not too far-fetched. However, George Mead, next, Social Self and Generalized Other, he refined this a little bit. So he agrees with Cooley's idea that the looking glass self exists, but he talks about the idea of humans having free will to conduct or not introspection. So, you know, Cooley would say if someone tells you you're dumb, that makes you feel dumb, and so you will likely act dumb. Mead would say someone could tell you that you're dumb, and then you have a choice. And you see the split right there in the bold. You could either reject what they say about you after you think about it, and that way you would not change because you're just going to throw it out. Or you could think about it and say, "Man, maybe they're right." You internalize it, and then that becomes part of your new identity. His notion of the generalized other, and I won't go through everything here, but it's what's known as the aggregate perception of you. So in other words, it's not what, you know, two people said this week and one person said last week, and then last year there were 5 people that told you something. It's overall, how are you seen sort of as a whole, as a person, in terms of your view on yourself. So again, just like with Cooley, primary group members are more important. So for these two going together, really, you could talk about here why some people may behave the way they do. You could evaluate messages to see if they are creating a climate where people will be more successful, more positive, or are they creating a climate where people are likely to fail or to feel bad about themselves, or a negative environment. Then you could take it a step further with Mead and talk about how we have that option to reject or internalize. So you do have people out there who have been told their whole lives, that you're one thing, whether good or bad. Let's say they were told they were bad, but then they made their mind up for themselves and said, "You know what? I'm not listening to that. I know who I am. I'm going to make it." Those are actually fairly few in number because that influence is so heavy from other people. But it can be done. We do have a choice if we want to internalize it or not. And that makes the difference between Cooley and Mead's theory. But you wouldn't have, Mead. You wouldn't have Mead, though, without Cooley. So they're definitely connected. Next up, to talk about why people identify or show their identity in certain ways, you have Erving Goffman's social dramaturgy. This is top 3 theories for me. When I learned this, it just was like, oh, I get it now. And so this is all about identity expression and management. And here is what Goffman thinks. He says that humans, all of us, are actors, and that we play a role. And the role that we choose to play and how we choose to play it will tell others who we are. And so we can control the way other people think about us to some degree by how convincing we are playing a certain role. He talks about we have multiple roles. And he says that for each one of these, we wear a mask, not a COVID-related mask, but we put on a different face, if you will. He'll talk about those using the language of fronts. Our role determines the expectations and norms. Those are our fronts that we put on for other people. You've heard, people say stop fronting, stop, it's big in music. That's where this comes from. So stop acting, stop pretending to be something you're not, would be the meaning of that one. And we do not wear masks to deceive others, really. We just wear them, according to Goffman, in order to be more like the idealized version of ourselves. So, when I was a kid, I remember thinking, I act differently different places. And I was not sure why, because I see other people, some did this, but some didn't, and there were usually negative outcomes for them. Like the kid in elementary school who, just always was in a bad mood, mean, talked just, trash to everybody. Maybe that's because that's what they learned at home. And so when they came to school, regardless of who they were talking to, that's the way they knew to talk. Whereas people who are more adjusted, more adapted to the world, they likely understand that there are rules that, though unwritten, are very important. You don't have a sign up in church that says, please don't curse here. But most of us know if you go into a church, whether you're religious or not, you're not going to curse in there because it's just not expected. And so the idea is we learn what's expected of us in these different settings, and we put on that mask to match those expectations. This is sort of like saying that you fake it till you make it, right? You just do your best pretending to be somebody or a type of person and see how far it will get you. It's whatever you say I am. I am whatever you say I am. That comes again. What mask do you see? Oh, okay. That's who you are. When people see us the way we want them to see us, we're in charge. That's what it is. We are letting them know, even though they're not really aware, that we're choosing how they see us. And that gives a lot of power to you as an individual. Now, there's a catch, though, and that is consistency. Because let's say that you act one way around, one of your friends, you act another way around your significant other, and you act another way around your parents. Now, if those two groups cross, right? So let's say now it is the first time your significant other meets your parents. And with your parents, you are hypothetically very proper, very polite, very respectful. But with your significant other, let's say you're a guy, and that significant other likes you in part because you're sort of a bad boy, right? You do your own thing. You don't really care what other people think about you. And that's the front that you've put on for that significant other. Now they go to meet one another, and you've got to make a decision. How are you going to act? Are you going to be what your parents expect from you? Or are you going to be what your significant other expects from you? There's problems there no matter how you do it. If you go full on the way your parents expect, obviously your significant other is going to question, do I really know this person? What's going on? Where did that come from? If you speak the way that your significant other expects, your parents could be really offended. That's a long-term relationship. What's going on with you? What mood are you in today? Is this significant other a bad influence on you? Lots of things come up. Maybe the worst thing you could do, though, is try to straddle both of these somehow and be like the polite bad boy, because then you're going to be off for both. And instead of one looking at you and going, the hell is wrong with you today? Both are going to be like, you just seemed a little different today. I don't understand. And that's a choice you'll have to make if you find yourself in this position. Shifting between identities is often seen as fake, but that is, again, shifting within one context, because the whole thing says we shift based on who we're with, where we're at, what we're doing. But when you shift frequently within a context with a person or a place or a thing, that's when you get seen as fake and you lose that control. So with these three theories, when we talk about identity formation and how we express it, Looking Glass Self says that we see ourselves in the mirror. Other people are like a mirror. We look at them, they tell us what they see, just like a mirror shows us ourselves, and that's part of who we are now. We go a step further to George Mead. He said that, yeah, that's true, but we get a decision here. Do we want to really take this seriously, this feedback we got from another person, or do we not? Do we want to really invest in it? Do we want to take parts of it? We get to choose because we have free will. And my favorite here, Goffman's dramaturgy, social dramaturgy, that we put on different fronts, we act different ways based on the expectations of others. And that ties into another theory that we'll get to in a minute, which is number one for me. So again, any research project you're going to do that discusses identity formation or sharing, you could use these folks. All right, next, this section, connection and disconnection. There's only one here because this one's sort of the all-star of the field. This is called relational dialectics theory by Leslie Baxter. And Baxter tells us that when we focus on our relationships, we often have competing desires. And what this means, she calls these dialectics, where we want something, but we don't want everything that comes with it. And the examples are connection versus autonomy. So you want a connection with someone, but at the same time, you don't want to be tied down. Man, how do you balance that? Because eventually, if you've been in relationships, you know this, the other person's going to want a commitment. And there's a difference between a connection and a commitment. You know, commitment is long term. And autonomy, just because you make a commitment doesn't mean you lose all autonomy, but they are opposites, right? So you want to be completely free and you want to be able to come and go as you wish and not answer to anyone and that sort of stuff, you know, the bachelor life. We want both. So how can we do that? It's tough. It's tough. Like the example there with parents, you want to maintain a relationship with your parents, but you also want to be your own person because you're an adult now. So you seek autonomy while not completely losing connection. Next, certainty versus uncertainty. One of the big things that you'll think of here is, you know, sort of like I want to know, but I don't want to know because I'm scared to find out. I've got the example of an STD test. You know, maybe you're not feeling well, or you were with someone after having some drinks, or whatever the situation might be, but you are concerned that you might have an STD. Part of you really wants to go get tested so that you'll know the answer to that question and you can finally rest, good or bad. Another part of you is scared to go because if the news is bad, you're really not ready for that. You don't want to hear that. And so that is the dialectic of certainty and uncertainty. Same idea with the significant other here, because these are all about relationships. Does this other person really care about me? Do they love me? Even if they say they do or they don't say they do, how do they really feel? I want to know. But do you? Because right now things are okay. You think if you can take it to the next level, they would be better, but you really don't know if it would be better or not. So what are you going to do? I don't know. You got to make that choice, but it is something you need to do. Sorry about these messages coming in. Hold on just one second. Let me get that. Okay. Next up, openness versus closedness. So here we want to be open and honest with people, but we also want to be private. We want to have some sense of privacy. So these are sort of like honesty issues. We want to open up because that means we have a connection. That means if you look at this whole sort of collective here, we're certain about what they think of us because we've been honest with them. We're open. But boy, we want to have some secrets because what if they don't like me if I tell them all of my secrets? I've done something that I think they might look at me different if I told them about it. In relationships, you'll often have this situation when the great discussion about number of sexual partners comes up. How many people have you been with? Oh God, talk about some issues that might arise. So, you know, you want that freedom. You want to sort of be a little mysterious and you want to have your own secrets, but you also want the other side too. So, this is something that can't really be solved with a choice. It's not really a preference, but it needs to be something like a deep desire. You have to make that decision for yourself. Which one do you want? And this really can define your relationship. And not only that, but the emotions that come with the struggle between these dialectics. So, again, for this one, if you're talking about relationships and why someone lies, keeps things hidden, why they won't commit or why they will commit, you could go back and plug in this particular theory. All right, next, something that will help us make sense of what we do. You've got schema theory. Now, this was started way back in 1932, but it was sort of revisited and restructured a little bit in 1999 by Young. So the idea with schema theory is that we organize information about our world in chunks known as schema. Bartlett, back in the 32, called schemas patterns of behavior and our understanding of that pattern. So the idea here is that when we are faced with a new situation, what our mind does is try to relate it to something we already know. This isn't like rocket science. It's brilliant, but it's also really natural for us to do. So, if you are talking to someone about a sort of a complex idea that's new to them, you often will break it down with an analogy. So let's say that you're talking about how your heart and your circulatory system works. Well, okay, let's think about that. And if you think of a car, well, so your engine is like your heart, right? That's the thing that's pumping with the cylinders. That's what your heart does. It's moving the fluid throughout the car. It's sending the gas into the cylinders so that energy can be created. It's kind of the same thing if you did this and that. One of the best examples I've heard, a guy was talking about life cycles of stars in a speech once. And I had no idea anything about this. And he could have been lying to me to this day. I don't want to know because it was a really good example. But his example was the size of a star is often indicative of how long it will live. And he said, think about it this way. Let's say you've got a drag race and it's a mile track and you put in, a cup of gasoline in the each car. Now, on one side, you've got a big Chevy Suburban, huge SUV. On the other side, you've got a Honda CRV, very small SUV. You put 1 cup of gas, and then you start them up and you send them on their way. Which one will go further? Well, the answer is the smaller car because it uses less fuel. And the idea there is bigger stars die faster because they use up their fuel quicker than do small cars. And again, this is a schema because we're able to think about SUVs and gas consumption much easier than we're thinking of white dwarfs and supernovas and this really theoretical space stuff that few people have a great knowledge of. So we like to think of things in patterns. Now, for a more communication-based approach, it could be how you experience or how you approach different situations. So first dates, for example. You have been on a few first dates, I imagine. And if not, you've seen first dates in movies. You take all that, your experience from personal experience, from what you've seen, from what you've heard, whatever it is, and you roll all that together and make your schema for how a first date should go. Now, we know if we think about it and step back, that's not a good idea to put an expectation on something like a first date. What if it doesn't meet the expectation? Does that mean that it will never work? No, it just means that it didn't fit your expectation. Do you want to try again? I don't know. That's up to you. But we use the schema of a first date. Same thing, first day at a new job, anything new, we apply a schema. So why do we do this? Well, you see it there. Fisk and Taylor say that humans are cognitive misers, and that means We don't like to use more brain power for anything than we absolutely have to. So we're lazy and we go with what we have experienced before instead of thinking, okay, so what do I know about this person? What do I know about where we're going? What do I know about what they think about where we're going? What do I know? Instead of connecting all the dots to where, you're like that meme where Charlie from Always Sunny has got the string going, around the room and connecting pictures. You just go with, well, in my experience, it's like this. There's something to that, but there's also a big danger. So in qualitative work, for example, many of you are subjectivists. You would value a schema because it's your experience of how something works, and that's just it. It's yours. Other people on the other side, more objectivist, would say things like, that's a hasty generalization. It's a fallacious argument, fallacy. You can't just say, well, I have experienced things in a certain way, so I bet it will always be like that. That's where we get prejudice. There was someone out there who said, I have had a bad experience with blank people, and therefore all blank people must be like this. Insert your group and attribute there. So we do it because it's easy to do. It's easy to do. We have self-schema, that's B. So how we perceive ourselves, it could be a confidence thing, it could be a lack of confidence. This is could be really good, really bad. If you are confident, you're probably confident because you've been successful in the past, and for you, that's what you know. You associate yourself with being successful. Now that could be in general, or it could be specific. I like to think of myself, I'm a very competitive person. And, my thought is if you let me know what we're going to do, what we're going to compete in, and you give me a little time to prepare, I bet I'll beat you. Except if it's like a physical challenge. Like if you want to race, nah, man, I'm good. You're going to win. Like I'm sitting this one out. But if it's like, who can paint the picture, who can type the fastest, who can just stupid stuff. Right. And it's because I've got this schema in my mind of things usually work out. So I'm staying positive. Now, you might be a very positive person overall, but have something very specific that doesn't work for you. And that's next. That's role schema, situational. So if you are thinking about yourself as a significant other, we'll go back to that example. You're really successful, you're really confident, but man, just relationships never seem to work out for you. So in that field, you might expect failure, and that will increase your chances of failure because that's what you expect now. That's your schema. You've seen it happen. It's gonna happen again, you bet. Similar is event schema. So chronological perceptions of common occurrences. So these are more specifically to the first date, but the idea there is anytime you are doing something that you've done before, you add to and evolve your schema. So for example, making these videos, I at first really didn't like it. I wasn't good at it. I still don't know if I am, but I would have issues with something. I'd need to stop. I would need to connect videos or start over. More practice had led me to be more successful. I got feedback talking about, the Mead stuff there. I got feedback from people saying I was a little difficult to understand and you couldn't see the screen clearly. Well, I can change at least one of those. And so I adjusted. Now I feel like I've changed my schema again to where it is more confident about making these videos. Something silly, but it's important, and it definitely fits into schema theory. Now, the last part of this is a structure aspect, and this is more big picture here. So how and where you have certain schemas mattered. So we develop schema at a very young age. The very first time we experience anything, we start to develop a schema of what to expect in the future. And this goes back to things like, again, why we have prejudice or racism. We're not born racist. I mean, no one is. It's what we experience that causes this to happen. Now, hear me. You know, I know a lot of little kids, especially like where I'm originally from, or even Mississippi, where I lived for a long time, little white kids who are distrusting of little black kids. And it's not because those little black kids did anything that would make them uh, distrusting. It's the case that they've been told, when you are interacting with this group, be careful, you can't trust them. It's not the experience that led you to feel like these folks, whoever they are, couldn't be trusted. It's what you were told from usually a primary other, like parent. You include that in your schema, and then you just assume from then on out that it will be, that way. And we can only modify this with experience. And last night on the news, I heard a guy say about America being divided right now. We need to get out and interact with each other more. He was making the argument that America should do the 1-year mandatory service after you turn 18, whether that's military or Peace Corps or, infrastructure projects, building something together, volunteering together. Because right now, people from certain backgrounds go to college, people from other backgrounds don't. They go to work. Usually those two groups are very separate. And they don't get to know each other. Therefore, they develop, based on what they've been told through schema, oh, you go to college, I bet you think you're better than everybody. Or, oh, you have a PhD, well, I bet you just think you're hot stuff. As opposed to some people, who are in the academy or whatever, saying things, oh, they just wouldn't understand. You have to really dumb it down for some folks. These assumptions are made about intelligence, personality, approachability, attitude, without ever really interacting. And that's the point that the guy was making is, if we were working together, we would get to know each other and see, just like men and women aren't that different, different groups aren't that different either. We all do things very similarly. Again, when I was in West Virginia as a kid, everyone who was not white, true story, lived on the same street. It was called High Street, and that's where you lived, whether you were rich or poor. And we had, of course, doctors of color, that kind of thing. And they would live on one end of High Street. That was like the more affluent area. And then if you were poor, you lived on the other end, but you were always a person of color. Then when I went to high school in Virginia, we had maybe 20 non-white students total in the whole high school. And so, I didn't have a lot of exposure to different cultures or different types of people in that way, demographically. So when I got to college, one of the first people I met, actually the first person I met at college, was a black guy named Randy Grubb, who to this day is my best friend. And it was so interesting to me because here we are, we hit it off when I thought to myself, schema-wise, it probably won't work out. Even if I haven't heard anything bad, it's like, I've never done this before, so I'm not going to be good at being friends with someone who doesn't look like me. Just try it. You'll see that you can do it. And when we do that, we see we're much more similar, and we are much less likely to hate each other, because it's hard to hate someone that you know and that you see do things that are just like the way you do them. But it's much easier to dislike them, distrust them, hate them if you don't know anything about them. That's why, like, when we were in Iraq as a country, we wouldn't talk about fighters or Iraqi citizens or civilians or whatever. It was insurgents. Today there were 80 insurgents killed. Okay, kill all the insurgents you want. I don't know anybody that's an insurgent. So it's this separation that we can close. Okay, another theory that will tell us more about what's going on around us is uncertainty reduction theory. This is from Charles Berger. Now, the idea here is that this only really works, though it's maybe a little bigger than that now, but it was intended to only work with first interactions. And it's the idea that people are driven by a desire to reduce uncertainty about others. So Cognitive uncertainty. It's unclear what someone else is thinking. Behavioral uncertainty. You can't predict what the other person's going to do. Proactive uncertainty. You can't predict the future relationship you would have with this person. And retroactive uncertainty, which is you're unable to explain why someone did something. It's quite common to have these feelings, especially in our culture. We are what's known as, in America, a low ambiguity tolerant culture. So we don't like things to be ambiguous. That's why, we're working on this as a culture, I think, but people will say things like, is that a man or a woman? If they have long hair, or if they are transgender, or, something like that. It would be, wait, is that a man or a woman? Is that a guy or a girl? Like, they want to know. Sometimes it's because they have a fear of the other, and, they may think, I don't like trans people, for example. And so they would want to identify them as such so that they know, oh, that's the type of person I don't like, even though they probably have never really met a trans person and got to know them. It could also be, where are you from? You'll hear that a lot. From asked of non-white people, or not obviously African-American people of color. Oh, where are you from? I love it when I hear this question and then I hear the response like, the east side like of the state, but they're expecting like, oh, well, ethnically I am, partially Korean on my mother's side and then partially Japanese. They that's what the person asking wants to know. Like, where are you ethnically from? But think about how awkward that sounds. What's your ethnicity? Why do you care, Mr. Weirdo? I mean, it's something that we do, though. We like to know this. If you hear a man, for example, speak with a higher range voice, or a woman speak with a lower range voice, is he gay? Is she a lesbian? These sorts of questions pop in there. Now, older generations were much more likely just to ask you about it. And Berger says that the more communication we have, the less uncertainty we have. Now, while it's not really culturally appropriate to ask some of these questions, it is really recommended to get to know people before you judge them. And so we can see the negative and the positive side of this particular theory. So, if we want to get to know someone, we could be much more certain about them. Now, hear me. That doesn't mean that you're certain and that's a positive judgment. It may mean that you become very certain that you do not like this person and you do not wish for future interactions with them. So here's a good example of this. I have a concealed carry permit in Michigan. I'm a liberal guy, but I'm from the South and guns are a thing. And so I go to register a gun that I bought at the courthouse in Ottawa County. Now, if you go to the courthouse in Ottawa County and you go to register a gun, you use the same window as the sex offenders who come in and talk to their parole or probation officers. And it's the same waiting room. It's a little strange. It's also the same window that you use to come and pick up police reports that you need a copy of for your insurance or whatever. So I am there and I'm sitting in a chair waiting. And this guy is sitting beside me, and I don't know why he's there. It's 50-50 for me. I try not to judge. So, I'm also not an outgoing person when I'm in those situations. So I wasn't talking. And one of my students walks in, and she's there to pick up a report. And she sees me, and all she's connecting this window to are, sex offenders. And I waved, and she kind of gave me a look and waved. And she had to come and wait. And so she came over and sat beside me, and she was like, what are you doing here? And I quickly said, hey, I'm just, no, not me, right? So I wanted to clear that up quickly. But she left. And there's a guy sitting beside me, and the same guy, as soon as she leaves, leans over, and well, we won't tell you what he said, but it was very lewd about, it referred to her skirt and what he would like to do with it. And there was communication before there was none, and I was uncertain if he was there as a sex offender or as a gun register. Within 15 seconds, I was really certain that he was there because he's a sex offender. And again, that doesn't mean positive judgment. That just means you're sure about your feelings about a person. Now, there are strategies you can use for seeking information about others. You could be very directive or active, as you see there, and interactive, and you speak directly to that person. You know, you're asking them, oh, tell me about yourself. What is this? Where are you from? That's the most dangerous because it's the most risky. It puts you out there because if the person gives you an answer you don't like, how are you going to react? How are you going to non-verbally react? More common would be a passive data collection, passive communication. So this is where you just observe, you know, what are you doing here? What do you look at? How are you dressed? Do you look like you are anxious? What behaviors are you exhibiting? And again, we can't be certain about our understanding because we're interpreting that as non-experts, but we can put it together and make some sort of knowledge. We could also do an active strategy, which is to ask other people about an individual. And think about elementary school dating here. So, you know, if you liked someone in elementary school, you would sometimes send them the little note, you know, the check yes or no kind of stuff, like, hey, do you like me? Yes, no. But you would also use their friends. So you'd be like, hey, can you talk to Kara and see if she likes me? Oh, what do you want me to say? Don't tell her I like her. I mean, I'm not saying I do. I just, this kind of childish stuff that we do. But at the same time, we still do that. I mean, think about political candidates, for example. We can't just sit down and have a conversation with them. What we can do is passively observe, see how they behave, and what does that tell us about them. We can maybe not ask directly to other people who know them, but like I'm thinking of Trump again, you know, his niece, I think, who is a psychiatrist, wrote a book about him, Too Much is Never Enough or something. You know, and so you could read that and think, oh, well, she tells me this is what she's seen. So now I'm going to incorporate that. But there's another account, I'm sure, of someone who said, no, it's a completely different way. And we have to do our best to make these judgments. And it's not about, again, positive or negative judgment. It's how certain we are about the person. Why do we do this? Well, because you might want to be part of their group. Maybe you like unexpected behavior or deviant behavior. That's again why bad boys, that personality style, are attractive to some people. And we want to know if we should interact with them in the future. Is it beneficial for us? And this doesn't mean like, you know, in an interactive or transactional way. It just means like when you meet someone who you know, feel strongly about, you want to know if it's a good idea to continue to interact with them. It's why you date someone and continue to date them or not. Because you do it until you have a level of certainty that you can make that judgment call, and then you can either cut ties or make stronger ones. Okay, the next theory here is social identity theory. This is probably third in my top three. This tells us that humans are gregarious creatures. And what that means is we like to gather in groups. We like to be part of groups. Not everyone, but as a species. We identify as members of groups because it's something that we see as largely rewarding or helps people know who we are. And this could be a formal group like a sorority or a fraternity. This could be a group that is less formal, so maybe it's your close group of friends. It could be a group that is worldwide but really has loose connectivity, like I'm a big fan of Arsenal, the soccer team from England. And so, you know, I'm part of that group, the Gunners. is the name of that, but if you've got a favorite sports team, you've got that identity. Your job is part of a group. So our personal identity and group identity often will merge in this process. And the example I'll run with here is the speech lab. When you come to work at the speech lab, you join a group that has expectations. They have expectations for your behavior, your performance. And if you don't meet those expectations, you are either encouraged to do so or you're removed from the group. And that's the way all groups function. So this idea of your identity merging is called depersonalization. So for example, if you were at the lab and had a bad experience, you don't remember the consultant's name, you're not going to say, Janine at the speech lab did a really bad job. And instead, what you're going to say, oh, how was the speech lab? Oh, speech lab's awful. That's not fair, but it's the way it works. And so that's why groups do a really good job, often more formal groups especially, of maintaining standards. Outsiders, again, they don't see individuals. They see the identity of the group. Groups have leaders, and those leaders, boy, it just got dark, display what's called prototypical behavior. Prototypical behavior is the ideal behavior for that particular group. Sorry, lost my spot here. That sounds great. I'm not sure what's going on with lighting. Give me just 1 second here. We'll go with the backup. Groups have leaders who display prototypical behaviors. So, the leader of the group sets the standard as to what others should do. And those are called prototypical behaviors. All other group members want to get closer to that. The closer to the model you are, the more status you have. If you are dissimilar to that standard, that prototype, you're known as a deviant, and then you are eventually removed or you leave the group. So an example here, you can take any of these, but military. The military has very strong, strict expectations for its members. The people at the top are the ones who have made it the farthest, which means they are behaving in a way that is really in line with those expectations. So if you model your behavior on theirs, you're more likely to be successful. But if you're not, then you get demoted, which is an encouragement for you to either fix something to change your behavior or to get out of the group. And if you continue to be deviant and you're not leaving the group, they'll kick you out. I mean, it's just the way it works. And this is, again, the same for big groups, small groups, formal groups, informal groups. It all works in this similar way. Same thing with the speech lab. I try to make the person who is the consultant of the year, as voted by their peers, sort of our student director, be more like them. If you get a handbook that tells you the rules, sometimes they're written down, sometimes they're not. And if you don't follow those rules, you get fired. I mean, it's as simple as it can be. All right, next, my favorite theory, communication accommodation theory. This is the last one, so hang in there. This is a combination of two other theories that came before. One was the theory of similarity attraction by David Byrne in 1961. This was dismissed because racists started using it. So the theory said that humans are more likely to interact with, converge upon people who are similar to them. And the theory didn't mean white people are more likely to hang out with white people, although that's part of it. And it's true. I mean, if you look at lunchrooms across America, in high schools, you will see diversity and you'll see, blended groups, but you'll also see tables full of the same type of person, whether that's, race, ethnicity, sex, you name it. But the idea there was common interests. So, I like to build guitars, play guitars. So my friend group, here, probably one Well, my best friend in Michigan plays guitar. I hang out with a group that plays guitar once a week, socially distant. But yeah, so it's that kind of thing where you're more likely to be around people with similar attributes as you. Racist would say we need segregated schools. And the reason we need that is because of this theory. It explains it. White people ought to be around white people. Black people ought to be around black people. And if you tried to blend the two together, it goes against this natural order. And oh no, so it's garbage. I mean, it's just hot garbage. So that one is dismissed. Then there's social accommodation theory, put out by Street, which basically says you often mimic is the wrong word, but you often display similar behaviors to those that you're interacting with, especially when you want them to accept you maybe as part of a group. Just like we just learned, when there's prototypical behavior by a leader, excuse me, other members act similarly to that prototypical behavior, and then they're more likely to be elevated to a higher position. So it's a combination of these two. And the idea is that when we communicate with others, we alter or accommodate our communication style to be more like the other person if we want them to like us. And we usually do. So when we think of it that way, if you are speaking to someone who is giving you maybe a job, it's a job interview, and you see that this person, this interviewer, has a particular style, you likely won't purposefully do this, but you might naturally start to shift a little bit and speak more like that person. Maybe it's the language, maybe it's the style, maybe it's the pronunciation of certain things, the formality with which you're speaking. It all shifts based on following the leader, if you will, in that sense. Now, if we want to be more similar, we would use what's called convergence. So we become more like them. If we want to be less similar, we use divergence. So we speak unlike them. We go in the opposite direction, if you will. We converge when we want to have people see us as similar, but we diverge when we want people to see that, hey, I'm not like you. So if you're ever having a conversation with someone who is, a known racist or sexist or whatever, some negative person, a bad person you don't want to be like, you will go out of your way to make sure that you speak differently so that you can show them we're not the same. I'm not on your side. I don't sympathize with you. I don't identify with you. And we never have to say those words. We can just do it in our style. If we want, again, to be seen more similar and it's a person in power, we call that upward convergence because we want to be lifted up in our social status or our group status. If it's someone that we want to be similar to, but we want to be sort of seen as less of an authority figure, we'll use downward convergence. My dissertation used this a lot, so I liked to understand how students viewed professors who use slang during their lectures. Is it something that works? Does it make you seem more relatable? Does it make you seem strange and out of place? What was the feel? The short version is it depends on who you are. Males have an easier time than females with using slang. See above for probably muted group theory. But with that, if I were to use a less formal style, it's downward convergence because I want you to see me as relatable, as someone similar to you, even though we're in different positions in terms of power dynamics in the course. Now, while this can often be a great thing and can be a positive, it can go wrong. There's two ways it can go wrong. One, if it comes across as disingenuous, it will be negatively evaluated. In other words, if it's clear that you're using a certain style just to try to fit in, but it's doing the opposite, it's making you stand out, you have failed. As I mentioned before, when I got to college, my first real friend was a black guy. And many of his friends were black guys, and so they became my friends. Now, we talked about this, a couple, 3 years later. But I made it a point never to try to imitate their style. Part of it was because they use the N word a lot, and I clearly was not going to do that. But, I was not them. And so for me to try to speak the way they spoke would be disingenuous. I mean, it would be obvious, like, oh, here we go. Yeah, okay. And I just didn't do it. And that was actually a very big benefit for me. Again, this came out later. We started talking about it, and it was respected that I didn't try to over accommodate or accommodate in any way, because that would have been disrespectful. So don't do it because you're trying to gain points. This is really bad. Like when high school teachers are really, advanced age professors, go a little overboard, and they'll come into a classroom, yo, how the kiddos doing it? Like, oh, shut up. Please don't do this. You're so cringy when you do that. So don't be disingenuous with it. Be, very light with the touch, if you will. Also, don't over accommodate. These are those dramatic shifts that we're talking about, like that professor. But the clear example here that many studies have been written on is baby talk to the elderly. So I've seen this happen, and I've also seen it happen with people who do not speak English as their first language. When someone is older, sometimes, obviously, you know some folks like this, their faculties start to break down a little. And so, they're not communicating as quickly, but they've not lost their knowledge. Like they're not an idiot suddenly because they're old or they speak slower. However, they're often treated just like a child would be. How are you today, Grandpa? Oh, would you like some more? All right, buddy. It's like you're talking to a little kid. I don't even talk to my kid like that. He's 3, because I just want him to, I don't want him to think that that's the way people talk, because it's not, except in really strange circumstances. What I've seen working in the speech lab is sometimes we train our consultants about this. You'll have someone come in, let's say, common for us is Saudi Arabia, and they don't speak English very well at all, and they're a little, embarrassed by it. You can tell. So what I tell them, no matter what you do, it's okay to slow down a little bit, but not noticeably. You're just slowing down because you're speaking to someone like this, because maybe they don't know the language as thoroughly as a native speaker. But most people will speak slower and louder. Hello, how are you? My name is they're not hard of hearing. Like, why are you doing that? It embarrasses them and you, and it has a negative outcome. So let's quickly review these theories. Next week, we'll move on to an annotated bibliography. We'll talk about what that looks like. But right now, for this week, you're going to enter a potential topic or two, and you're going to give feedback to others. What I would also like you to think about is which one of these theories, or another one if you know of others, would fit best. So why we communicate in certain ways, maybe why we behave in certain ways as parts of groups, how we become certain if we like someone, don't like someone, are afraid of them, if we should run, if we should stay, if we should laugh, if we should cry. We use uncertainty reduction techniques. We have schema that explain why we think of certain things in certain ways, and largely why we react in certain ways. Even if the situation doesn't always call for that reaction, it's what we have put together in our head as a schema for the situation. If you're in a relationship or you're talking about relationships, and by the way, this can be romantic or not, why you often feel conflicted about wanting to be connected but still be autonomous, wanting to be certain about how the other feels but not right now. Why do you feel that way? We'll talk about why people act different ways based on their fronts, as Goffman would say. So if you're exploring something similar, you could use that. By the way, that front could be like an online persona. I know a lot of people are doing social media. How we can choose to accept or not the opinions of other people versus the original idea of, even if we don't accept these ideas about others that others have for us, I think there's truth to this. It's still part of who we are. I mean, someone may tell me hey, you're dumb. You're so stupid. And I know I'm not, but still the fact that someone thought that, genuinely thought that, makes me at least think, what did I do to sort of give them that vibe? How can I never give that vibe again? It impacts you in some way, even if minimal. If you're looking at differences, especially male-female or masculine-feminine, again, doesn't have to be male-female, you might look at muted group and how standpoints make a difference. In standpoint theory, is the more marginalized you are, the broader view you might have. And then, of course, we talked about co-cultural theory, which is explanatory of why men and women behave, communicate in different ways. And it goes back to how we're trained to see male culture and female culture as just that, these two different cultures that are within a larger context. So those are your theories that I wanted to cover. Again, if you've got more from a different class, feel free to pull that in. Otherwise, you can go with one of these. If you're having trouble, maybe none of these fit exactly right, shoot me an email with a topic idea and the kind of theoretical backing you're looking for, and I'll try to hook you up with something that might be a better fit. Otherwise, until next time, as always, stay safe. And if you have questions, shoot me an email, let me know. And I will see you back here next week.